in the Realms of Mediumship by Chico Francisco Candido Xavier and inspired by the Spirit Andre Luis. Chapter 25, Mental Fixation. On the way back, Ilario and I directed the conversation towards getting Aulas to teach us something about mental fixation. I had noticed this phenomenon on many occasions and had tried to study it. However, in order to help my colleague, who was newer than I in the endeavors of the spirit world, I joined in, showing the utmost interest. Ilario had been unable to disguise the astonishment that had overcome his soul ever since the manifestation of the Strangler from Tuscany, and said in concern, "Try as I might, I'm finding it very difficult to grasp the enigmas of the spirit's crystallization around certain situations and sentiments. How can the mind linger on particular impressions and hang on to them as if time were standing still? For example, let's take the case of that unfortunate friend who has been immobilized for centuries in his ideas of vengeance. How could he have been in such a lamentable state for so many years without having reincarnated?" Aulas listened attentively and pondered. We have to understand that, after the physical body dies, we continue developing the thoughts we cultivated during the corporeal existence, and we mustn't forget that the law delineates universal principles that we cannot betray. Subordinated to evolution, how can we grow spiritually without obeying its order of harmony and progress? A fixed idea can trigger the indefinite stagnation in time of mental life. Let's symbolize the stage of the soul's reincarnation as being the valiant front in the battle for individual and collective growth, a battle in which the heart must arm itself with sanctifying ideas to win its self-sublimation, the greatest victory. The mind is the soldier in the battle. If it bravely wins, as soon as it is led to death's evaluation, it rises vertically to the front in the direction of the higher spheres, and its triumph is expressed in its ascension to a higher level. But if it fails, and such a failure is nearly always the result of carelessness or rebelliousness, at death's assessment, it goes back horizontally to the rear, where it joins maladjusted spirits of every kind for an indefinite period of treatment. In these battles, the rear is the tormented zone of the neurotic, the crazed, the maimed, the wounded, and the infirm of every sort. In light of our interest in his exposition, Aulas continued after a brief pause. Of course, victorious legions do not forget those who have lagged behind. Hence the missions of love and self-denial we see working diligently wherever there is disharmony and pain. "And what about the soul's stagnancy?" asked my colleague, eager for knowledge. In our metaphor, we can define it quite accurately. Time is always what we make of it. To better grasp the subject, let's remember that the hours on a clock do not vary, but they are not always the same in our mind. When we are happy, we don't even notice the minutes. When we are satisfying our ideals or innermost interests, the days fly by. However, in the company of suffering or apprehension, we feel like time has stopped completely. When we don't make an effort to overcome the slow motion of anguish, the afflictive or obsessive idea ends up corroding our mental life, leading us into fixation. Once we reach that level, time seems to stand still because in spirit we start to gravitate around the neuralgic point of our maladjustment. Any big inner disturbance, be it passion or disenchantment, cruelty or vengeance, jealousy or desperation, can immobilize us for an indefinite time in its web of darkness if we rebel against the imperative of incessant progress with the supreme good. Let's analyze further our symbol of combat. The inflexible clock indicates the time for everyone. However, time is brief for those who triumphed and long for those who lost. For the triumphant, the days are happy and honorable, but for the defeated, they are bitter and tear-filled. If we do not rid ourselves of thoughts of suffering and defeat through constant work for our renewal and progress, we become ghosts of affliction and discouragement, maimed in our highest hopes or trapped in our inner wounds. And when death surprises us in such conditions, emphasizing our subjective experience, if the soul does not make the heroic effort of supreme self-denial, it can easily get tangled up in the problems of fixation for years on end, sometimes even centuries, in the repetition of unpleasant reminiscences, living and nourishing itself on them. Indifferent to anything else but its own pain, idleness, or hatred, the discarnate soul lost in its own thoughts is like an animal in the lethargic sleep of hibernation. It isolates itself from the outside world, vibrating solely around the hidden imbalance on which it strives. It no longer hears, sees, or feels anything outside the deranged sphere of itself. The subject matter was of immense interest for my personal observations. On many occasions, I had closely probed sleeping consciences that were like spirit mummies after death. I reminded the assistant of those cases, to which he replied, "Indeed, during the habitual rest that immobilizes it after death, the mind stagnated in the forsaking of the law suffers anguishing nightmares, awakened almost always in a state of full alienation that can persist for a long time, cultivating passionately the impressions in which it believes it can find its own happiness." "And what is the most appropriate remedy?" I asked respectfully. "Many of these disoriented souls," explained the instructor, "finally tire of evil and seek regeneration on their own, whereas others awaken to the new responsibilities for self-readjustment during our work of assistance. They are the wounded soldiers who try to correspond to the missions of love that visit their places of recovery. They understand the imperative of the dignifying struggle to which they have been called, and assisting those who assist them, they return to the good battle, on whose front lines they adjust to the service they are able to perform. Others, however, recalcitrant and rebellious, are gently obliged to return to the battle in order to rid themselves of their self-imposed lethargy. The experience of a difficult situation in a corporeal body is akin to a jolt of long duration, during which the soul is invited to recuperate. For that, we use the concourse of the subject's loved ones who harbor him or her in the family sanctuary. But in such cases, wouldn't compulsory reincarnation be like an act of violence? Asked Ilario attentively. What do we do on the earth when an insane person becomes part of our family? Don't we assume the responsibility for his or her treatment? Would we wait for the deranged person's own decision regarding the measures needed to restore his or her mental stability? It is true that we have the duty to honor the free conscience that is capable of deciding for itself the various problems of the evolutionary struggle. However, when faced with an irresponsible and ill brother or sister, our assistance denotes loyal friendship, even if such intervention entails a pain-filled readjustment process on his or her behalf. After a brief pause, Alice continued, "Reincarnation under such circumstances is like taking an inert patient to a certain friction machine for the necessary awakening. Intimately juxtaposed onto the cellular field, the soul is the happy prisoner of the physical body, whose atomic world it influences, and in turn is influenced by, suffering the attrition meant for its recuperation." These significant remarks invited us to meditate and learn. Highly impressed, I said, "Due to such fixations, we see spirits suffering deplorable amnesia. When they communicate with incarnate brothers and sisters, they don't have a precise recollection except for matters on which their worries are set. And when they exchange impressions with us, they seem like obstinate psychotics. Exactly. This is why they usually require a lot of gentleness in the way we handle them. And when they are led to reincarnate while imbalanced, do they suddenly return to reality?" I asked. "Not always." Changing the tone of his voice, the assistant continued, "In most cases, progress is very slow. We can verify this in the study of mentally impaired children who convey dolorous enigmas for the world. Only the extreme love of the parents and family can infuse warmth and vitality into such little ones, who often remain for many years in the dense matter as tormented members of society, enduring sufferings that seem unjustifiable and strange, but which serve them as an effective remedy. It is also possible to observe the truth of our statements in so-called schizophrenics and paranoids who have lost their sense of proportion, harboring an erroneous concept of themselves. Nearly all of the congenital mental disturbances in incarnate individuals are related to fixations that preceded their return to the earth. In many cases, such incarnate spirits go from cradle to grave in a gradual process of recovery, experiencing beneficial jolts through human therapies and domestic demands, impositions of customs and social conflicts which provide them the advantages of what we may regard as the extroversion indispensable for the cure of their psychosis. The conversation was instructive and suggested further study. However, other endeavors awaited the assistant elsewhere, putting an end to our lesson.